The day my son helped his wife carry my sewing boxes to the curb, he was wearing the flannel shirt I'd mended 3 times. I noticed the careful stitching at the left elbow, my stitching, and I thought, that's the last thing I'll ever fix for you, Brian. I didn't say it out loud. I just stood on the porch of the house I'd lived in for 31 years and watched him set down the last box with the practiced efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times before. Nicole stood in the doorway behind him, arms folded, watching with the particular expression of someone supervising a moving crew. That morning she had said, with the warm, measured smile she reserved for difficult transactions, "This is just business, Martha, nothing personal." She was still smiling when I picked up the boxes and walked to Douglas Kane's truck. And that was the day I started counting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it actually began, because the end only makes sense when you understand what was built before it and what had been quietly, methodically dismantled. Edward Holloway died on a Tuesday in November, 3 years before any of this. He went the way he'd lived, without fuss, without drama, in his own bed, with the windows cracked open the way he always liked them, even in cold weather. He said he slept better with fresh air. I used to pile extra blankets on my side, and he would lie there in his undershirt, perfectly content, while I grumbled about the draft. After he was gone, I kept the window cracked for almost a year before I admitted that I was doing it just to feel him still in the room. The house smelled different with it closed. Everything smelled different after Edward. We had been married 41 years. We had built the house on Crestmore Lane from the mortgage up. Edward with his careful budgets and his Saturday mornings at the hardware store, me with the curtains and the garden and the kitchen that always had something on the stove. It was not a grand house. 3 bedrooms, a front porch that needed repainting every 4 years like clockwork, a backyard with a massive oak that dropped leaves from October through January and drove Edward to distraction every single autumn. But it was ours, completely and genuinely ours. And when Brian grew up and moved out and came back with Nicole, I was glad to share it, glad to make room at the table, glad to think the house would have young energy in it again. I should have paid closer attention to how Nicole looked at the rooms, not the way a daughter-in-law looks at her husband's childhood home, with curiosity, with warmth, with the slight awkwardness of learning someone else's family geography. She looked at it the way she looked at listings. I was a school teacher for 32 years, middle school, home economics, and craft, and I developed early a fine-tuned sense for what a child was actually paying attention to. Nicole was always paying attention to square footage. She was a real estate agent, had been since her mid-20s, quite successful by all appearances, good clothes, a leased BMW, a confident handshake. Brian had met her at an open house where he'd gone to look at a condo he couldn't afford. That was the kind of story they told about themselves at dinner parties, laughing, and it was charming enough that I smiled along. What I noticed and filed quietly away was that in the telling of the story, Nicole was always the one who found something worth having in a place Brian hadn't intended to buy. Brian, my son. I have spent 3 years trying to write a sentence about Brian that is fair, and I keep arriving at the same place. He is not a bad man in the way that bad men are bad. He is the more common kind of damage. A man who is easily led by whoever he most wants to impress, and who has never in his life been asked to choose between his comfort and his integrity. When he was 7, he cried for an hour when he accidentally broke a neighbor's window with a baseball. Real tears, real remorse. At 44, he helped plan to sell his mother's house out from under her and said nothing for 4 months. People change, or maybe they don't change. Maybe they just find the version of themselves that circumstances call for. The house on Crestmore Lane was in Brian's name. I had signed it over after Edward died, or I thought I was signing something else. End of estate paperwork, Brian had said, with his hand on my shoulder, the week after the funeral when I was still sleeping in 2-hour intervals and forgetting to eat. I had trusted my son the way you trust someone whose diapers you changed, someone whose nightmares you sat up for, someone for whom you have mended 3 flannel shirts at the elbow. I signed the document. I did not read it carefully. That is the only mistake I made in this entire story, and I have made my peace with it. The first sign came so gradually that I nearly missed it. It was a Thursday in early March, about 18 months after Edward's death, when Nicole came home from work with what she described as exciting news about a potential opportunity. She sat down at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, the one Edward and I had bought at an estate sale in 1987 and refinished ourselves. And she opened her laptop and said she'd been thinking about how to optimize the property situation. That was the phrase, optimize the property situation. I was making chicken soup at the stove, and I remember the way the word optimize floated across the kitchen like something from a different language. A language spoken in offices where people didn't make soup. Brian came home from work an hour later, and the 3 of us ate dinner, and Nicole talked about interest rates and market timing and the phrase asset protection. And Brian nodded in the particular way he nodded when he was following along with something he had already been told privately and was now pretending to hear for the first time. I filed that too. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine when Nicole said the word protection. I said very little. I had learned by then that Nicole's proposals always came in stages. The first stage was always framed as concern. The second stage was the ask. Over the following weeks, the concern intensified. There were conversations about title complications. Had I known, Nicole mentioned carefully, that properties held in single names after spousal death could create difficulties in certain circumstances. Had I thought about whether Edward had any outstanding business dealings that might surface? She used the word liability with the frequency of someone who had been practicing. Brian sat in these conversations like a man waiting for a bus, occasionally contributing a supportive murmur. I answered her questions. I asked a few of my own. The answers she gave me were technically accurate and comprehensively misleading. Somewhere in the 4th week of these conversations, I began sleeping badly. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't bolt upright in the night. I simply began waking at 3 or 4 in the morning with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't immediately place, lying in the dark and listening to the house settle around me, the oak in the backyard, the refrigerator hum, the particular silence of a house where the person you lived with for 4 decades is no longer breathing. I would lie there and think about Edward, and then, without wanting to, I would think about Nicole's face when she looked at the kitchen and said it was a good size. I called Gloria Page on a Saturday morning in April, while Brian and Nicole were at the farmer's market. Gloria lives 11 minutes from me if you take Birchwood to the county road. I know the exact time because we have been making that drive back and forth since 1998, and we have logged it the way old friends log the small measurements of a shared life. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. "Talk," she said. "Something is wrong," I said. "I don't know what yet." "I'll be there in 12 minutes, she said. "Put the kettle on." She made it in 11. I told her everything I had noticed, the conversations, the documents mentioned but not shown, the way Brian wouldn't meet my eyes. Gloria sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her mug and listened without interrupting, which for Gloria represents a significant act of self-discipline. She had been a bookkeeper for 22 years before retiring, and she had that particular quality of people who work with numbers. She heard the gaps. He already knows something you don't, she said when I finished. I think so too, I said. Okay, she said, and then, I may have to do a little creative research. Gloria, nothing illegal, she said. Probably. I'll use the public records thing. I'm very good at the public records thing. She paused. Also possibly Facebook. Nicole has a real estate page. People leave an astonishing amount of information on their professional Facebook pages, Martha. It's almost poignant. I told her to be careful. She told me not to worry. Neither of us believed the other. The next watercolor session was 2 weeks later at Ruth Finch's house. Ruth had the best light in the afternoons. North-facing windows in the spare bedroom she'd converted into what she called her painting parlor, and the rest of us called that room with all the stuff. Ruth Finch had been a librarian for 34 years and had the librarian's gift for accumulation. Every surface held something interesting. The painting parlor had 3 unfinished landscapes, a collection of antique inkwells, a basket of hand-dyed yarn that had been there since 2019, and a cat named Archimedes who regarded all human endeavors with philosophical indifference. The 4 of us, me, Gloria, Ruth, and Debbie Stark, had been meeting every other Thursday for 12 years. The club had started as a bookshop reading group, migrated through a brief and unsuccessful phase as a beginner's knitting circle, and arrived at watercolor almost by accident when Debbie showed up one evening with a paint set she'd bought at a garage sale. Nobody was particularly talented. That was rather the point. Ruth made precise, careful studies of objects. Debbie painted landscapes that looked like the landscape had been in a minor accident. Gloria produced work of baffling, abstract color that she titled things like Feelings About Tuesday. I painted fabric, textures, patterns, the way light hit different weaves. I had been doing it my whole life in one medium or another. That Thursday, I painted badly. My brush kept skittering. I was thinking about the conversation I'd had with Brian 2 days earlier, when he'd sat me down in the living room with the particular posture of a man about to say something rehearsed, and told me that he and Nicole had been exploring some financial restructuring options, and that it might be beneficial for everyone if I considered a transitional living arrangement. I had asked him, in the very quiet voice I reserve for the moments when I need to think clearly, what that meant. He had used the word practical 4 times in the following 5 minutes. I had not cried. I had waited until his car left the driveway, and then I had sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet where I kept the good soup pot and the cast-iron skillet Edward had inherited from his mother, and I had pressed my palms flat against the cool tile and breathed. At Ruth's painting parlor, I told them everything. Archimedes the cat moved from the windowsill to the arm of my chair midway through, as if offering solidarity. Debbie put down her brush. Gloria, who had already heard the broad strokes, was making a face I recognized from years of friendship. The face of a woman who has information she has been waiting for the right moment to deploy. I found something, Gloria said. We all looked at her. I was on Nicole's professional listings page, she said. She has a sold column. She usually updates it pretty quickly when something closes. She opened her phone. There is a listing in that column for Crestmore Lane, listed 6 weeks ago, sold 3 weeks ago. Closed date pending, 18 days from now by my count. The room went very quiet. Even Archimedes seemed to recalibrate. Sold, I said. Sold, Gloria confirmed. Debbie said something that is not repeatable in polite company, but accurately summarized the situation in 4 words. Ruth said very carefully, "Does Brian know?" "Brian," I said, with a certainty that surprised even me, helped her price it. I drove home that evening with the windows down despite the April chill because I needed the cold air on my face. I needed to feel something concrete and physical. The trees on the county road were just beginning to bud, that particular early spring green that looks almost luminous against a gray sky. And I drove through them thinking about 31 years, about the kitchen floor and the soup pot, about the oak tree that drove Edward to distraction, about the signing I had done without reading in the week after the funeral when I was still putting extra blankets on my side of the bed. I was not going to cry. I had decided that at some point in the previous hour, without quite being aware of the decision, something had shifted into place the way a long, resistant drawer will suddenly slide home, firm, final, aligned. The woman who had driven to Ruth's house that afternoon and the woman driving home were not precisely the same woman. The difference was small and quiet and absolute. The next morning, Brian came to the kitchen and told me that he and Nicole had found a lovely apartment for me. Senior living community, very nice amenities. He had a brochure. I looked at the brochure. I said I would think about it. He seemed relieved by this. He had clearly been bracing for an argument, and he poured himself coffee and kissed my cheek and left for work. Nicole came downstairs 40 minutes later, said good morning in the warm, professional tone she used with me when Brian was in earshot of the preceding moments, poured coffee, and left. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands around my mug and I looked at the room. The cabinet with the soup pot, the hook by the back door where Edward's coat had hung until I finally moved it the second winter. The slight scuff on the baseboard where Brian had crashed his bicycle indoors at age 9 and been grounded for a week. I looked at all of it and I pressed it into my memory the way you press a flower, carefully, deliberately, so that it keeps its shape. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Simona Crest, and my neighbor Douglas Kane had mentioned her 3 years prior when he'd dealt with his own estate complications after his wife passed. "Sharp as a tack and twice as pointed," Douglas had said, which was high praise from a man who awarded compliments sparingly and with considerable profanity in between. I found her card in the bowl by the telephone. I still kept a bowl by the telephone, the way women of my generation do, as if the telephone might ring at any moment with something that needed to be written down. And I called her at 8:15 in the morning. She had an opening at 2 o'clock. I took it. Simona Crest's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and old paper in the way that real legal offices do, not the aspirational, sterilized way of the newer firms on the boulevard. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and the particular manner of someone who has heard every possible variety of family catastrophe and classified them by type. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened. Start from the beginning." I started from the signing. I told her everything, the document I hadn't read, the months of Nicole's carefully arranged conversations, the listing I'd found through Gloria, the closed date 18 days away. I laid it out in sequence, the way I used to lay out fabric for cutting, measured, straight-edged, no wasted material. Simona listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at her legal pad for a long moment. "The property is legally Brian's," she said. "That part is clean." "I know," I said. "What we can potentially argue," she continued, "is undue influence at the time of signing. You were a recent widow. You were in grief. The document was presented as routine estate administration. If we can establish that the nature of the transfer was misrepresented to you, and given your condition at the time, given the context, There's a legitimate argument. She paused. It's not guaranteed, but it's real. How long does it take? To file an emergency petition to delay the sale? 2 days. The petition itself delays closing until the matter is heard. She looked at me over her reading glasses. The sale can't close while there's an active legal challenge to the title. I asked her what it would cost. She told me. It was more than I had in my checking account, but less than I had in savings. The savings account Brian had never known about. The one I had kept since I started teaching, because my own mother had told me when I was 19, always have money that is only yours. It is not about distrust. It is about having a floor. File, I said. She nodded once, without ceremony, the way a person nods when they were expecting that answer. I'll need everything you have, any documents you kept, any communications, any records of the conversations. I have been keeping notes, I said, since March. She looked at me with something that might have been appreciation. Of course you have, she said. I walked out of her building into the mild April afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the sun on my face, and thought, 18 days. Then I drove to Douglas Kane's house. Douglas Kane was 74 years old and had lived directly across Crestmore Lane from us for 22 years. He was a large, slope-shouldered man with white hair that never lay flat, regardless of weather or effort, and he walked with a carved oak cane that he'd made himself after his hip replacement 3 years prior. He had been a carpenter before he retired. Trim work, cabinetry, the kind of patient joinery that takes years to learn. His yard was meticulous in the specific way of widowers who put their energy into what remains. The beds were weed-free and geometrically edged. The walk had been repointed recently, the porch railing freshly painted. In the side yard, behind a low picket fence, lived a bronze-feathered turkey named Betsy, who regarded all visitors with ancient suspicion and had once chased a package delivery driver 40 yards down the street. Douglas was on his porch when I pulled up, as he frequently was in the afternoons. He watched me get out of the car and cross the street without changing his expression. "I heard the moving boxes," he said, by way of greeting. "They're not moving boxes yet," I said, "but they might be soon." "Come and sit down," he said. I sat in the other porch chair, the one that had been Constance's, his wife's, and that he kept there with the cushion that was beginning to show weather damage at the edges. The afternoon was cool and the street was quiet. From the side yard came the low, irregular sound that Betsy made when she was processing information. I told Douglas what I had told Simona Crest, though in less formal terms. He listened with his hands wrapped around his cane, looking at the middle distance, nodding occasionally. When I got to the part about Gloria finding the listing, his jaw set in a way I had seen before. The particular expression of an old man encountering information that confirmed something he had already suspected and hoped was wrong. "That boy," he said, in a tone that managed to convey both sadness and a comprehensive opinion of Brian's character. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a while. Betsy made another sound from the side yard, something between a gurgle and a declaration of intent. "Ed told me," Douglas said finally, "about 2 months before he got sick. He said Nicole made him uncomfortable. Said he couldn't point to anything specific, just that she looked at the house the wrong way." I felt something cold move through me hearing that. Edward had said nothing to me. He must have decided not to worry me, or decided to wait until he could point to something specific, or decided, the way Edward sometimes decided, that his unease was not fair grounds for complaint. He had been a fair man, my husband. It was one of the things I had loved most about him. Sometimes fairness costs more than it should. "I have a lawyer," I said. "She's filing tomorrow." Douglas nodded slowly. "Good. About damn time somebody put a stop to this. Betsy appeared at the fence gate, looking at us with one amber eye. Douglas pointed his cane at her without looking. "Don't even think about it," he said. She retreated partially. I went home and cooked dinner from habit, because after 31 years, the kitchen still expected it of me. Brian and Nicole came home at their usual times, and we ate together in the careful silence that had replaced conversation over the previous months. After dinner, Nicole went to her office, and Brian stayed at the table with his phone, and I washed the dishes by hand the way I always had. And when I turned from the sink, he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom," he said. "Yes," I said. "It's going to be fine," he said. "The apartment looks really nice. We looked at it again this week, and the community room has—" "Brian," I said in the voice, the quiet one, "I know about the buyer." The color left his face in a specific way, from the center outward, like a flame going down. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I know about the listing," I continued, drying my hands on the dish towel, keeping my voice even. "I know it's been sold for 3 weeks. I know the closing is in 18 days. I folded the dish towel and hung it on the oven handle. I've been to see a lawyer." He stood up so fast, the chair scraped back. "Mom!" "I'm not asking you to explain yourself tonight," I said. "I'm asking you to sleep on what you've done. That's all." I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I lay in the dark listening to the oak tree and thinking about the linen closet upstairs. Specifically about the old sheet bag on the top shelf, the one that held the quilt I'd been adding to for 30 years. I had started it the year Brian was born, one locket square cut from every significant piece of clothing the family had worn. Every occasion, every season. Edward's first good suit jacket from 1982, cut to 3-inch squares. Brian's first school uniform, the dress I'd worn to my mother's funeral. It wasn't finished. It had never been finished because life kept providing material. I had not packed it yet. I had deliberately not packed it. Nicole had walked past the linen closet 3 times in the last week, and I had watched her each time, waiting. The confrontation I had been expecting came the following Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen making bread. I bake every Saturday, have done since I was 23, and I wasn't going to stop for a real estate closing. When Nicole came downstairs in her weekend clothes and said, with the carefully modulated tone of someone who has rehearsed, "Martha, I think we need to have a direct conversation." I set my dough on the counter and covered it and wiped my hands and said, "All right." She sat at the kitchen table. I remained standing. "We know you've spoken to a lawyer," she said. "I want you to understand that this doesn't change anything legally. The property transfer was properly executed. Brian signed, you signed. Whatever your attorney told you about undue influence," she made a small, precise gesture, dismissive. "Those cases are very difficult to prove." "I know," I said. "So I'm asking you, as family, are we?" I said. My voice was very quiet. It surprised even me how steady it was. 3 months ago, I might have cried. I had no tears left for this woman. Are we family, Nicole? Because family doesn't run a background search on the house they're living in 18 months before they tell you they want you to leave. Her eyes sharpened. For the first time since I'd met her, Nicole Sharp looked caught. "That's not—" "The listing went up 6 weeks ago," I said. "The buyer's name is Patrick Reimer. He's closing in 16 days now, not 18, because I assume you moved the date when you realized I knew." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I was done standing. You've known Patrick Reimer for longer than the listing, haven't you? The silence that followed was the most informative thing Nicole had said to me in 3 years. You're trying to cause problems, Martha. I'm trying to understand, I said. Your husband has business debts he hasn't told his mother about. The sale proceeds were going to cover those debts. You've known about the debts since before you married him, haven't you? Because you are very good at knowing these things. You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm a school teacher, I said. I spent 32 years watching children pretend to know things they didn't and pretend not to know things they did. I got very good at telling the difference. I stood up and went back to my bread. Tell Brian I'd like to talk to him this afternoon. Alone. Nicole left the kitchen without answering. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, sharp and clipped, and then the sound of the bedroom door not quite slamming. Nicole never quite slammed anything because it would have been imprecise. I kneaded my bread and thought about Patrick Reimer. The talk with Brian that afternoon was the hardest thing I did in this entire story. Not because he was cruel. Brian was not cruel. He was sorry, in the particular way of men who are sorry that things turned out this way, while remaining committed to the choices that caused it. He sat in the armchair that had been his father's, and he told me, finally, the whole of it. The business partnership that had gone sideways, the debt that had accumulated over 2 years, the way Nicole had suggested that the Crestmore Lane property was the cleanest solution. He told me she had found Patrick Reimer. He told me he hadn't wanted to tell me because he didn't want to worry me. You didn't want to worry me, I said. Mom. Brian. My voice was not unkind. It was simply final. I signed those papers in the week after your father died. I signed them because you handed them to me, and I trusted you. Do you understand what you asked me to trust you with? He looked at his hands, his father's hands, wide and capable. He had never learned to use them the way Edward had. I know, he said. I don't think you do, I said, but you will. I stood up and went to the linen closet and took down the sheet bag with the quilt. I carried it to my bedroom and closed the door. I did not come out for dinner. The petition Simona filed the next morning hit Nicole's closing schedule like a stone through glass. I know this because Gloria called me that afternoon laughing so hard she could barely speak, having been monitoring Nicole's Facebook page with the dedication of a field researcher. She just deleted 3 posts, Gloria said. 3 posts, Martha, in 20 minutes. Whatever's in that petition scared the hell out of her. Good, I said. The petition did 3 things simultaneously. It flagged the property transfer for review, it notified Patrick Reimer that there was an active title dispute, and it sent a notice to Nicole's broker, because Nicole had listed the property through her own agency, which Simona pointed out created a significant professional conflict of interest that the state licensing board might find instructive. It delayed Patrick Reimer's closing by 42 days. In the 10 days between my confrontation with Nicole and the moment when Brian asked me, very quietly, at the kitchen table, if I would consider not proceeding with the legal case, 4 things happened in the house on Crestmore Lane. Nicole stopped eating dinner with us. Brian started coming home late. The atmosphere of the house changed in the specific way a house changes when the people in it have stopped pretending. Something unlocks in the walls, as if the structure itself has been relieved of an effort. I packed my things during those 10 days. Not everything. Not the furniture, not the things that were built into the house the way memories are built into a place, but my materials, my fabrics, my threads and needles, and the 2 Bernina machines I had bought over the years with my own money and that Nicole had once described as a lot of equipment for a hobby. I packed the quilt. I packed the box of patterns I'd been drafting since 1994. Not formal patterns, just my own notations, the shorthand of a woman who has been making things for 50 years. I packed the photographs. I packed the bowl from by the telephone. And I called Douglas Kane. "Douglas, I'm going to need somewhere to stay." "I know," he said. "Guest cottage has been empty 8 years. I had it cleaned out last month." A pause. "Don't know why, just did." I thought about Edward and about the kind of friendship that operates on frequencies too low to explain. "Thank you," I said. "It's not a favor," he said. "Bring your bread stuff. I've been eating store-bought since Constance died, and it's a goddamn crime." I moved on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Brian was at work. Nicole was at a showing. I loaded my car 3 times, carrying boxes across the street in the April afternoon, while Betsy watched from the fence with magnificent indifference. Douglas stood on his porch and directed me to the guest cottage, a small structure behind the main house. 1 room with a kitchenette, a proper bedroom, and windows on 3 sides. It smelled of fresh paint and old wood and something I couldn't immediately name. I set down the last box and stood in the center of the room and breathed. It was very quiet. It was entirely mine. I was unpacking the fabric boxes when Douglas knocked on the open cottage door and came in without waiting, which was exactly how I expected Douglas to enter any room. He was carrying a bread loaf wrapped in a clean cloth, and he set it on the table and stood there looking at me with his hands around the top of his cane. "Hang on," he said. "Got something else." He went back to the main house and returned carrying a large glass jar of what appeared to be wildflower honey and a small envelope. He set the honey down first, then the envelope. "Ed gave me some money, long time ago, when Constance died and everything was a mess. $8,000, said not to worry about paying it back." He looked out the window. "I paid it back. Told him he could keep it or give it away or burn it. I didn't care. I just needed the account to be square. He said fine. Told me he'd put it in a jar." He nodded at the envelope. "I think he put it in a jar. Seemed like the kind of thing he'd do." I opened the envelope. Inside was a note in Edward's handwriting, those careful, slightly left-slanting letters I had read for 41 years. And behind it, folded twice, a cashier's check for $8,000, made out to me, dated 8 months before Edward died. The note said, "For whatever she needs next, she always needs something, and she always figures it out. E." I sat down on the edge of the bed and held the note for a long time. Douglas stood quietly, which for Douglas also represented a significant act of self-discipline. Very quietly. "He knew," I said. Quietly. "He suspected," Douglas said. Low. "Said something wasn't right. Didn't know what yet." He cleared his throat, which would Douglas serve the purpose that other men use tears for. "Rough. Anyway, the cottage is yours for as long as you need it. Betsy'll probably come in through the window if you leave it open. Don't leave it open." He went back to his house. I sat with Edward's note until the light changed. The legal case moved on 2 tracks simultaneously. On the first track, Simona filed the formal challenge to the property transfer, arguing constructive fraud based on the circumstances of signing, grief, misrepresentation of the document's purpose, the specific vulnerability of a recent widow being handed papers by her son. On the second track, she filed the professional conduct complaint against Nicole with the State Real Estate Licensing Board, citing the conflict of interest in listing a property involved in a family dispute through her own agency. Nicole responded by hiring a lawyer. Her lawyer's name was Henderson, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer you hire when you have a weak position and enough money for expensive letterhead. Long on procedure, short on substance, fluent in delay. Simona dispatched Henderson's first motion with 4 pages of case law and a brief note that I imagined was written in the tone of a woman cleaning something mildly unpleasant from the bottom of her shoe. Brian's business partner, a man named Garrett, who I had met 3 times and found each time faintly slippery in the manner of people who cultivate plausible deniability, heard about the legal case through channels I didn't track and immediately withdrew from their partnership, citing unresolvable structural issues. Brian's business was, in practical terms, the partnership. Without Garrett, without the Crestmore Lane sale proceeds, Brian was staring at a debt structure with no foundation under it. I learned this from Gloria, who had expanded her research from Nicole's Facebook page to a broader survey of the situation. His credit rating is apparently extremely bad, Gloria told me on the phone from her car, where she conducted her most important calls for reasons she had never fully explained. Like embarrassingly bad, the kind of bad where banks laugh. I didn't know, I said. I know you didn't, she said. He spent 3 years not telling you things, Martha. You spent 44 years thinking your son was honest. That's not a failure on your part. I thought about that. It settled differently than I expected. Not as absolution, but as simple fact. You can only know what you are shown. The wisdom is in noticing, eventually, what hasn't been shown. The second watercolor session during this period was at my cottage, the first time I had hosted any gathering in years, in a room that was mine in a clean, uncomplicated way that the house on Crestmore Lane had not been for a long time. I moved the sewing boxes to make room, set up the card table with the usual supplies, and Debbie brought a bottle of wine and Ruth brought a tin of the almond cookies she made from a recipe her grandmother had brought from somewhere in Central Europe that she refused to share in writing but would demonstrate in person to anyone who asked. Gloria brought cheese. I baked bread in the small cottage oven, which performed better than I'd expected. We painted and talked, and the afternoon moved the way good afternoons do, not linearly, but in the looping, comfortable way of old friendships, where you are simultaneously in 4 conversations and none of them feel rushed. Okay, but in a just world, Debbie said, gesturing at her painting with a wine glass, we could absolutely go over there and key Nicole's BMW. We're not doing that, Ruth said. I'm not saying we should, Debbie said. I'm saying in a just world. In a just world, my knees wouldn't click when I stand up, Gloria said, which tells you everything about just worlds. My phone rang. I glanced at it. Simona Crest. The room went quiet simultaneously, with the synchronized instinct of women who have been friends long enough to read a room from a single glance. I need to take this, I said. We're not moving, Debbie said, as if that were in question. I stepped to the window and answered. Simona's voice had the quality of someone carefully not showing excitement. The licensing board has sent Nicole's agency a preliminary notice, she said. That will likely result in a formal investigation. More importantly, Patrick Reimer pulled out. I gripped the phone. He pulled out of the sale? He got cold feet when the title dispute made the local property news. He was apparently a cash buyer who didn't want complications. A pause, with controlled satisfaction. Without the sale proceeds, Brian can't service his debt. His creditors will begin enforcement proceedings within 60 days if he doesn't restructure. Behind me, I was aware of 3 women pretending very poorly to be interested in their paintings. And the house? The house cannot be sold while our petition is active. And with the undue influence argument, Martha, Another pause, more deliberate. I think we have a reasonable path to restoration. Not guaranteed, but real. I thanked her and ended the call and turned around. Debbie was openly watching me. Ruth had put down her brush. Gloria was looking at her phone. We have a path, I said. Gloria looked up from her phone. Also, she said, with Nicole just changed her Facebook status from in a relationship to blank. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Patrick Reimer, I said. Patrick Reimer, Gloria confirmed. Debbie refilled everyone's wine glass with the gravity of the moment. Life in the cottage had its own rhythm, and I settled into it with a speed that surprised me. The small space organized itself efficiently around my materials. The Berninas on the long table under the east window where the morning light was best. The fabric sorted by weight and color in the clear bins along the wall. The patterns and notes in the flat drawer I'd bought from Douglas's storage. Betsy visited twice a week through the yard gate, occasionally pushing the cottage door open with her beak to survey the situation before Douglas called her back with the weary authority of someone managing a family member with poor impulse control. I began finishing the quilt. I had not intended to make it a project. I had started with the intention of taking 30 minutes one evening to add a few squares, and I had emerged 4 hours later, stiff and absorbed, with a new section done. There is something in the act of hand quilting that insists on time. The needle going through the layers, top, batting, backing, again and again, each stitch tying the layers together, building structure from repetition. I had taught quilting for 7 years, and I had always told my students the same thing. The stitch is not decorative. The stitch is structural. Everything else depends on it. It was in those long evenings with the quilt that I also began drafting, seriously and methodically, the idea I had been turning over in my mind for years without admitting it was an idea. The quilts I made were different from the standard patterns, not different in a precious or performative way, but different in the way that anything made by someone who has spent decades thinking about a craft is different. My seam allowances were non-standard, optimized for hand finish. My fabrics were chosen with the kind of grain reading that most hobbyists don't bother to learn because it takes too long to matter at a small scale and matters enormously at a large one. My patterns were mine, developed in 20 years of mental notes, refined in a notebook I'd kept since the mid-90s that I had always privately thought of as a kind of technical journal. I photographed 12 squares from the unfinished quilt with Douglas's good camera. He had been a hobbyist photographer in a past decade and still had the equipment, and I posted them on a platform that Debbie had set up for me the previous year and that I used intermittently and without great conviction. The post went modestly viral in quilting circles within 6 hours. Not famous viral, niche viral. The specific, concentrated attention of a community that recognizes something new when it sees it. I had 53 direct messages by morning. 2 of them were from a woman named Karen Aldis, who ran an Etsy shop selling hand-cut fabric kits and had 11,000 followers and a clear eye for pattern quality. She wanted to know if I sold kits. I did not sell kits. I told her so, and then asked, with no particular agenda, what a fair price for a kit based on my patterns might look like. She told me a number that made me sit down. I wrote it in my notebook next to the words, "Ed would not believe this." I spent 3 weeks testing, adjusting, photographing. The first kit went up on a Tuesday. It sold in 4 hours. I listed 12 more and sold them within the week. Gloria, who reviewed all financial decisions that involved my savings account, with the proprietary attention of a woman who had spent 22 years keeping other people's books, looked at the numbers and said, "You need to register this as a business." "I know," I said. "Today," she said. "I know," I said. We named it Holloway Textile Studio, after Edward and after the street and after the idea of a way through. I registered it properly, trademarked the name, opened a business account. Simona Crest referred me to a small business advisor who spent 40 minutes reviewing my initial projections and then looked at me over his glasses and said, "Have you considered actually opening a physical space?" I told him I had a cottage. He said, that was a start. The case came to its first formal hearing in June, 6 weeks after I had moved to the cottage. The hearing was in a beige courtroom with fluorescent lighting and the particular atmosphere of a place where difficult things are resolved in flat procedural terms. Simona sat beside me in a dark jacket with a folder that contained 214 pages of documentation. Brian sat on the other side of the aisle with Henderson and Nicole, all three of them in varying states of a composure that was being maintained with effort. Brian had lost 30 pounds since April. It showed in his face, the way weight loss in middle age shows, as subtraction rather than improvement. He looked like a lesser version of himself, or the version that remains after something essential has been removed. He caught my eye once, briefly, and looked away. Nicole did not look at me at all. Simona made her argument with the economical precision of someone who has prepared more than she is showing. The document had been presented to a recent widow as routine estate administration. The nature of the transfer, a complete title shift, not a protective co-ownership arrangement, had not been explained. The signing had occurred 7 days after the death of the woman's husband of 41 years. The property had subsequently been listed for sale through an agency operated by the transferee's spouse, without the original owner's knowledge, and a sale negotiated, and, Simona said, pausing with deliberate calm, with a buyer who had a prior personal relationship with the listing agent. Henderson objected to the last point as irrelevant. The judge asked Simona to clarify. Simona provided 3 pages of documentation, including text messages retrieved as part of the licensing board's preliminary inquiry, establishing that Nicole and Patrick Reimer had been in contact for 14 months prior to the listing date. The silence in the courtroom was the kind you could hear. Brian made a sound beside Henderson, not a word, just a sound, and Henderson put a hand on his arm. The transfer document, Simona continued, was presented to my client as estate management paperwork. The actual effect was to divest her of all ownership rights to a property she had co-purchased and co-maintained for 31 years and occupied continuously since that purchase. In the specific circumstances of its execution, recent bereavement, absence of independent counsel, misrepresentation of purpose, we submit this constitutes constructive fraud and undue influence. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, the judge ordered a 60-day review period and an independent audit of the transfer circumstances. He also issued a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of the Crestmore Lane property pending resolution. We walked out into the June afternoon. Douglas Kane was on the courthouse steps. He had driven in that morning, Betsy notably absent from his truck, which I understood to be a significant gesture of restraint on both their parts. He looked from Simona to me. "Well?" "We have 60 days, I said. "That's enough," he said. Then from the parking structure behind us came a sound, a specific, carrying, unmistakable sound that should not, under any circumstances, have been present in a municipal parking structure. A sound like a horn and a complaint and an ancient grievance, all compressed into one resonant note. Douglas closed his eyes very briefly. "I told you to stay in the truck," he said, to no one visible. Betsy rounded the corner of the parking structure at a purposeful trot, bronze feathers catching the June sun, regarding the assembled legal professionals with the impartial confidence of someone who has been in worse situations. Henderson, who was coming through the courthouse doors behind us with Brian and Nicole, stopped dead. "Is that a—" "Yes," Douglas said. He pointed his cane. "Betsy, we discussed this." Betsy stopped in the middle of the courthouse walkway, turned her head 45 degrees, and appeared to consider the situation. Then she walked calmly to Douglas and stood beside him like a well-trained but philosophically independent companion. Nicole stared at her with an expression I had not previously seen on Nicole's face. Pure, unguarded bewilderment. "That's my neighbor's turkey," I said, to no one in particular. "She has opinions about legal proceedings." Simona Crest, who had maintained a flawless professional demeanor for the entirety of 3 hours in a courtroom, covered her mouth with her hand. I thought, if you had told me a year ago that I would be standing on courthouse steps with my turkey, my lawyer, and my neighbor at 70 years old, I would have said you were describing someone else's life. But it was mine. Every improbable, infuriating, stitch-by-stitch inch of it was mine. The 60 days moved quickly for someone who was paying attention. The Holloway Textile Studio Etsy shop reached 4,000 sales in the first month, which Gloria described as absurd and Debbie described as righteous. Karen Aldis featured the patterns in a roundup that went to her 11,000 followers, and something shifted in the algorithmic attention of that particular corner of the internet. The corner where women who have been making things for decades are recognized, suddenly and retroactively, as having been skilled all along. I began teaching on Thursday evenings. It started with Ruth, who had asked once, diffidently, if I would show her my grain reading technique, and had turned, through Ruth's characteristically librarian failure to keep anything private, into a group of 9 women around the card tables in Douglas's large kitchen, which he had offered without being asked after deciding the cottage was too small. He sat in his armchair in the corner during these sessions, ostensibly reading, actually listening, occasionally interjecting with an opinion about fabric that was surprising in its precision, until I remembered that he had done trim work for 35 years and understood grain and texture the way carpenters always do. Betsy attended the first 3 sessions uninvited. Douglas eventually put her in the enclosed back run during class nights, which she treated as a personal offense, but accepted under protest. 3 weeks before the 60-day review hearing, Nicole made her move. I cannot say I didn't expect it. I had been expecting some version of it since the moment her licensing board investigation began, because Nicole was a woman who had always compensated for defensive pressure by attacking laterally. She appeared at the Millbrook Craft Fair, which runs the last weekend of August in the town park, with a table set up under a banner that read, Sharp Home Textiles. Nicole Sharp's name, Nicole Sharp's banner, featuring a collection of quilting kits and patterns that were, in the phrasing I later used in my submission to the State Copyright Office, substantially derivative of the Holloway Textile Studio designs I had been selling for 3 months. I was also at the craft fair. I had a table on the opposite side of the central path, which I had booked in June before I knew Nicole would be attending. Ruth was with me, helping arrange the display. Debbie was wandering the fair and eating a funnel cake. Gloria was at Nicole's table. I want to be precise about what Gloria was doing at Nicole's table. She was shopping. She was examining the kits with the intent expression of a woman considering a purchase, asking questions in the friendly, curious manner of a craft fair browser, taking photographs of the packaging for reference purposes. She was doing this because I had asked her to, the previous week, in the matter-of-fact way you ask a former bookkeeper to document something that will need to be documented. When Nicole's table attracted a small crowd at mid-morning, attracted it, I should note, partially because my table was drawing more traffic and Nicole had repositioned her banner to intercept some of the foot traffic, Gloria came to find me. She had 11 photographs on her phone. She sent them to Simona Crest, who had come to the fair for reasons she described as personal interest, and that had led her to a position about 20 feet from Nicole's table, with a clear sightline. Nicole, to give her credit, had not used my exact patterns. She had adjusted the seam allowances, changed the fabric colorways, used different descriptive language on the packaging. She had done this carefully, the way someone does when they have given thought to what constitutes legally actionable copying. The problem was that Nicole was a real estate agent, not a textile professional. She had adjusted the things she knew to adjust, the visible surface, and had not adjusted the things she didn't know were there. The structural logic of the pattern sequence, the grain reading method embedded in the cutting diagrams, the specific, non-standard seam allowance formula that I had developed over 20 years and that Simona had helped me document in the copyright registration 3 months prior. By noon, Ruth had documented the specific correspondences on a yellow notepad with the thoroughness of a woman who spent 34 years ensuring that knowledge was correctly recorded. By 1 o'clock, Simona had 4 pages of photographs and a legal pad of notes. By 2 o'clock, 3 of the craft fair vendors who knew me had independently noticed the similarity and were talking about it at their tables. At 2:15, a woman named Carolyn Dreiss, who ran a quilting blog with 14,000 subscribers and had bought 2 of my kits in August, walked past Nicole's table, stopped, picked up one of Nicole's kits, examined it for approximately 45 seconds, and then walked directly to my table. "Clearly, carefully, Martha," she said, holding up Nicole's kit. "Carefully. Is this related to your pattern system?" Quietly, "It's not authorized," I said. Carolyn Dreiss looked at the kit for another moment. Then she took out her phone and began taking photographs. By 4 o'clock, it was on her blog as a developing story. By 7 o'clock, it had been shared in 4 quilting Facebook groups with a combined membership of 60,000. By 9 o'clock, Nicole had taken her table down and left the fair. The next morning, Simona filed a copyright infringement notice. What happened to Nicole's licensing investigation, which had been running in parallel? The State Real Estate Licensing Board completed its preliminary inquiry and referred the matter for formal hearing. The specific finding? That Nicole had represented both seller interests and had a prior personal relationship with the eventual buyer without disclosure was the kind of finding that real estate boards treat with significant seriousness because the entire edifice of property transaction depends on disclosed interests. Her license was suspended pending the formal hearing. She could not work as a real estate agent. She could not close transactions. She could not specifically benefit from any sale of any property during the suspension period. The Holloway Textile Studio copyright infringement settlement was agreed 4 weeks after the craft fair. Nicole, advised by her attorney, settled rather than litigate, probably because litigation would require depositions, and depositions would have introduced her text message history with Patrick Reimer into additional proceedings, and Nicole was already managing several proceedings. The settlement terms included a financial payment and a public statement that the Sharp home textiles kits had been withdrawn due to intellectual property concerns. The Crestmore Lane case resolved in October, 6 months after I had first walked into Simona Crest's office. The independent audit confirmed the circumstances of the transfer: grief, misrepresentation, absence of counsel. The judge found that the transaction had been executed under conditions that did not meet the standard for informed consent by a vulnerable party and ordered the transfer voided. The property returned to its pre-transfer status, jointly held by the estate of Edward Holloway and Brian Holloway, with Martha Holloway established as the estate's primary beneficiary, which meant, in practical terms, that Brian owned half a house he couldn't sell, couldn't afford the taxes on without my agreement, and couldn't keep without resolving a debt structure that had no remaining buyer to resolve it with. He did what was, in the end, the only honest thing he had done in 3 years. He came to Douglas's cottage on a Tuesday evening, knocked on the door, and when I opened it, he stood on the step with his hands in his pockets and said, in the voice of a man who has run out of other options and arrived, finally, at himself, "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." I looked at my son. He was thinner than he'd been in April, and there was something in his face that was different from the face I'd known, something that had been scraped away or that had peeled off in the months of consequence. He looked like he had arrived somewhere painful and correct. "Come in," I said. He came in. I made tea. We sat at the small table in the cottage kitchen, the table that fit exactly 2 chairs, which seemed right, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about lawyers or listings or settlement terms, about his father, about the debt, the real story of it, not the managed version, but the actual sequence of bad decisions and worse cover-ups, about what he had told himself during the 4 months of the listing and what he had stopped being able to tell himself and when, about the moment he had realized that Nicole had been running calculations he hadn't been party to from well before their marriage, about grief and how he had handled his father's death by not handling it at all, by burying himself in the business partnership and letting Nicole manage the domestic architecture of the house, while he convinced himself that everything was running smoothly because he wasn't looking at it. I listened. I asked questions. I did not forgive him that night. Because forgiveness is not a thing that operates on the schedule of apologies. It moves at its own pace, along its own logic, and cannot be rushed. But I did not close the door. He left at 10:30. At the door, he stopped and looked at the cottage, the warm window light, the clear bins of fabric visible through the glass, the Bernina silhouette on the work table. "Dad would have been," he started, and then stopped. "I know," I said. "He would have told you to fix it." "Yeah," he nodded. "I'm going to try." I watched him walk back across the street to the house on Crestmore Lane. The October sky above it was the particular blue of early autumn evenings, deep and specific, the kind of blue Edward used to call the best light of the year. The oak in the backyard was just beginning to turn. Nicole had moved out in September. I had not asked for details, and Brian had not offered many. What I knew was that she had gone to a rental property in the adjacent town, a property not, as far as anyone could determine, connected to Patrick Reimer, whose name had disappeared from Gloria's research about 3 weeks after the craft fair incident. Patrick Reimer had, it seemed, a specific and limited tolerance for complications. The formal hearing on Nicole's real estate license took place in November. I did not attend. The outcome: a 6-month suspension with conditions for reinstatement, including additional ethics training and supervised practice, was emailed to me by Simona in a single line with no commentary, which was exactly the right amount of commentary. Holloway Textile Studio had its first local retail presence in February, when I rented a small shop space on the ground floor of the Millbrook Arts Building, the same building where the watercolor supply store had operated for 11 years, and where on Thursday evenings in the back gallery, a group of women gathered every other week to paint badly and talk honestly and refill each other's glasses. I rented the shop space and I hung the quilt in the window, not in a frame, not behind glass, hung free on a simple wooden rod that Douglas had turned for me, one long, smooth piece of oak from a branch that had come down in the backyard of Crestmore Lane in last winter's ice storm. He had brought it to the cottage without explanation and left it on the porch with a note that said, "Figured you could use it for something. You always figure something out." The quilt hung in the window through February and March, every locket square representing a moment. Edward's suit jacket, Brian's school uniform, my mother's dress, a piece of curtain from the first apartment Edward and I had rented in 1979, the yellow dress I'd worn when Brian was born. The whole of a life assembled from fragments, showing the light through it, each stitch structural. Debbie came to see it the day I hung it and stood in front of the window for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for Debbie. "How much are you asking for it?" she said finally. "It's not for sale," I said. She nodded. "Good," she said. The card on the quilt read, "Holloway, ongoing, not for sale." I unlocked the shop at 9 on the first morning and put the kettle on and stood in the space. The Berninas on the long table, the clear bins along the wall, the front window with the quilt in it, and I thought about the word Nicole had used. Business. Just business, nothing personal. She had meant it as a kind of armor, a cleanly amoral justification, the language of transactions in which people are properties to be assessed and moved. I had turned it over in my mind many times since she said it, and I had arrived, finally, at a different understanding of the word. Everything I had built was business. The kits, the shop, the Thursday classes, the careful documentation, the trademark and the copyright and the accounts, all of it was business, conducted with the full weight of my professional knowledge and my material intelligence and the 30 years of my marriage that had taught me what it meant to build something that lasted. I had not done it in spite of anything or to prove anything. I had done it because this was what I knew how to do, and the circumstances had simply, finally, made space for it. I poured my tea. Through the window, I could see the morning light on the quilt, moving through it the way light moves through anything made of layers, broken into its components, diffused, warmer and stranger than it had been coming in. Gloria called at 9:15, which was early even for Gloria. "Well, how does it look?" "It looks like mine," I said. "Perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. Also, I drove by, and the quilt is absolutely gorgeous in that window, and I may have cried a little, but if you repeat that, I'll deny it." "I know nothing," I said. Douglas came by at noon. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the quilt the way men of his generation look at things they consider well-made, with a particular stillness, a recognition. Then he came inside and looked at the Berninas and the bins and the whole organized functional space and nodded once. "Ed would have said something embarrassingly sentimental," he said. "He would have," I agreed. "Good thing I'm not him." He sat down in the chair I had put by the door, a comfortable chair for students and visitors and anyone who needed a place to sit while watching someone make something, and set his cane across his knees. "I'll stay for a while. Make sure you don't have any technical difficulties." Betsy was in his truck. I could see her in the side window, watching the street with the ancient amber patience of a creature that has decided the world will come to her eventually and is prepared to wait. Brian came in March. He stood at the door, looked at the quilt, and was quiet for a long moment. He had put some of the weight back on. He had taken a job, actual construction work, not management, which had been his father's work and which he had spent his whole adult life positioning himself above. He was learning things he should have known at 20. "Mom," he said. Nicole filed her reinstatement application. Her lawyer's talking about us potentially resolving the property situation as part of a— "I know," I said. "Simona told me. I'll think about it." He nodded. He was learning not to push. He looked at the quilt again. "Is that Dad's jacket?" "Third row from the bottom," I said. "The blue squares." He stood and looked at it for a while. The morning light was good, the particular February verging on spring light that comes in low and specific through clean windows. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," I said. And then, because it was true, and because he needed to hear the truth more than comfort, "I'm better than okay, Brian. I've been better than okay for a while." He nodded. He almost smiled. It was the particular almost smile of someone who has not yet earned the full version, but is working toward it. And I thought, that is sufficient. That is, for now, exactly sufficient. The kettle was on. The bins were organized. The quilt was in the window, turning the morning light into something complex and beautiful and entirely its own. I sat down at the Bernina and I began to sew. Sometime later, on a Thursday evening in the back gallery of the Millbrook Arts Building, 4 women sat at card tables with watercolors and wine. Ruth was working on a study of the inkwell she'd found at a flea market in September. Debbie was painting something that had started as a landscape and was evolving toward abstraction. Gloria had produced a square of deep teal and burnt orange that she had titled October, and that the others privately found more interesting than anything she'd done before. Martha was painting fabric again, a close study of the corner of the quilt, the place where Edward's blue suit jacket met the yellow dress from Brian's birth, the seam between them precise and quiet. "So," Debbie said, refilling her glass, "Nicole's applying for reinstatement." "She is," Martha said. And nothing. She may get it, she may not. Either way, it has nothing to do with me. Gloria looked up from her teal square. "That's very zen of you." "It's very tired of me," Martha said, and they all laughed. The laughter was the kind that comes from somewhere true, the specific, particular laughter of women who have been through something together and arrived on the other side. Ruth set down her brush and looked at her inkwell study, tilting her head. "I think this is actually good," she said, with a genuine surprise of someone who had not expected it. "It is," Debbie said. "Annoyingly good." The evening moved the way it had moved for 12 years and would move for 12 more, in the looping, layered, unhurried way of things that are built to last. The wine went around, the paintings accumulated on the tables. Outside, the April evening settled over Millbrook in the way it always did, the oak trees beginning to bud, the particular blue of the sky just before full dark, the light in the shop window down the street, warm and steady. Martha looked at her painting, the quilt square, the 2 fabrics meeting, the stitch between them. She had spent all winter looking at it, and she was not done looking. She picked up her brush and added one more line.